In this video, we're going to be going over Chapter 4, Analyzing Work and Designing Jobs. Now, in this, what we're talking about doing is really thinking about what it is that we want people to be able to do and how are we going to be setting it up so that they can get the job done so we can meet organizational goals. In this, we're talking about a lot of workflow design. In other words, how are we going to actually push the work through? What are the positions that people hold, and then the specific duties that go along with it. Now, one of the first things that you want to think about when you're putting together this job aspect is a workflow analysis. You want to be doing an analysis as far as what it is that people are going to be doing and how are they going to be doing it. So you take into account the inputs, what kind of equipment they're going to be using, and then what kind of knowledge, skills, and abilities do they need in order to do the tasks that are necessary to get the output that is necessary for meeting goals. When you start thinking about the design, you also want to think about the organization structure. Remember, structure follows strategy. So you have to think about what is the strategy of the organization, how will we put together the structure as far as who reports to whom, and then how are we going to actually put together those various jobs and what it is that people will be doing. One of the key things that's going to be necessary is what's called a job analysis. A job analysis is where you're identifying what is it that the person actually has to do in order to achieve the goals that are necessary for that particular job. That job analysis, getting that detailed information, comes into play when you start putting together your job descriptions and specifications, and then also when you start doing evaluations of that person and their job. You put together that analysis and you get the job description, which is going to have the title, a brief description as far as what are the tasks, duties, and responsibilities of that job, and then what are the essential duties that go along with that. This is an example of a job description for somebody who's working on a train for Union Pacific. You'll see that there's an overview, there's a description of what it is that the person will be doing, what are the duties that that person has to accomplish, and then the major tasks and responsibilities that go along with that. Typical of a sample job description. You also will need to put together what's called a job specification. Now, the job specification, as it says here, is listing the skills, knowledge, and abilities that go along with that particular job. What kind of information does the person have to know? What kind of skills does the person have to bring to it? General abilities, in other words, can they read, can they communicate, things like that. And then any other kind of characteristics that might be necessary. Maybe some sort of a licensing. So, for example, if you're talking about nursing, they have to be licensed. This might be an example of job specs for that train crew service person. In other words, requirements at least 18 years old, be able to use computer keyboards, solve problems, strong vision and hearing, physically strong, be able to lift 50 pounds, things like that. Where you get that information typically, normally, is coming from the people who are actually in those jobs and the current managers. There are some other outside things that you can use. In other words, that dictionary of occupational titles and then the Occupational Information Network. Most people will utilize the folks who are within the organization. Who is it that's actually doing the job, and what is it that those managers are requiring? The job analysis is really important because what happens is you start thinking about how are we going to design and redesign that work. We've talked about HR planning. In other words, what are the strategies that are going to be necessary? What is it that the organization needs in order to achieve its goals and strategies? Doing selection. In other words, who are we hiring? Doing the training, performance appraisals, etc. This is an example of what's called a competency model. In other words, one of the things that will happen from that job analysis is putting together a model as far as what is it that the person has to be able to do, and then how do you evaluate them on that? So, for example, for this project manager aspect, in this, it has three key things: organizational planning and skills, communications, and financial and quantitative skills. And then it gives you a description of what each of those things are. And then how do you actually measure how well they're doing in each of those? Now, the various trends that go along with job analysis is basically saying, okay, things are changing over time. Every time somebody goes into a job, they basically will make it, adjust it somewhat to their own thing. And so what happens is, as time goes on, the organizations change, some of the work changes, people have their own preferences, and there's going to be differences as far as what those jobs will be doing over the years, over the time. One of the things that you want to think about is also design and redesign of jobs. In other words, identifying what are the key things that the person must be doing, the job itself, and then also where it fits as far as the organization is concerned. When you start thinking about job design, in other words, thinking about, okay, so what is it that the person will be doing? You can design for various things. You can design for efficiency. Maybe what you want to do is design for motivation. In other words, what can we do to make sure that whatever we're asking that person to do, they can be very motivated in getting that done? Maybe you design for safety, or you start thinking about mental capacity. When you start thinking about designing for efficiency, that's going along the lines of you have somebody who's on a production line, and you're trying to make it as efficient as possible. You'll design that job so that it can be very efficient. It's more the industrial engineering thing. You might start thinking about designing for motivation, okay? And we'll talk a little bit about enlargement, enrichment, and things like that. Maybe one of the things you want to do is design for safety. So, for example, if you're talking about one of those firefighters, one of the things they'll do is design those jobs to make them as safe as possible, because those are inherently dangerous jobs. And designing for mental capacity. Maybe one of the things you want to do is design things for a scientist or an architect or something along those lines. So when you start thinking about industrial engineering, one of the things you're trying to do is reduce the complexity. In other words, what can we do to reduce the number of steps that has to happen in order for someone to get the job done? When you start thinking about designing for motivation, you start thinking about the job characteristics model. With the job characteristics model, there are key things that come into play. What kind of variety do you have as far as the skills that are necessary? What kind of task identity? In other words, what is it that you see as far as the entire job or the entire organization is concerned? How significant is your task? How does it make an impact on someone? How autonomous is it? In other words, can the person do what it is that they need to do throughout the day without a lot of direction from the supervisor? And what kind of feedback is going to be necessary? When you think about the job characteristics model, less motivation. In other words, jobs that are less motivating will have few skills needed. They work on just a small part of the whole. In other words, maybe they're working on just, if they're making chairs, working on just the right front leg, and they're doing right front leg throughout the day. When you start thinking about more motivation, you need more skills. Maybe you're seeing an entire piece. Instead of just one leg, what you're doing is you're seeing the entire chair. Or maybe you have a major impact on others. In other words, a physician, a doctor may have a major impact on others. So when you start thinking about the characteristics of a motivating job, these are the types of things that make jobs much more motivating. Now, in designing those motivational jobs, there's different things you can do. Enlargement, extension, and rotation. Rotation is pretty easy to understand. In other words, you're moving from one workstation to another, learning some of those different jobs. Job enlargement versus job extension. With job extension, what you're doing is you're taking simple jobs and kind of adding some similar skills and things to it. So, for example, you've been making the right front leg of a chair for all day long. That's all you do. Well, maybe one of the things as far as extension is you're making all four legs. With job enlargement, what's happening is you're really giving it more depth. In other words, you're not responsible just for all four legs. You're also responsible for all of the inventory. In other words, making sure that you have the right amount of inventory that's coming in on time. That would be an example of job enlargement. Job enrichment is basically giving you more decision-making authority. So, for example, you start talking about things like self-managed work teams. With self-managed work teams, they're making more decisions as far as who's going on vacation when, what kinds of work are we going to be working on as a team, things like that. There's also alternatives as far as how to make jobs much more motivational and how to keep people motivated. One of the things that we can do is flex time. In other words, there's going to be a core time when people need to be there, where everybody needs to be there, and you need to be there working. The thing is, you may be able to come in at 9 and then leave, say, at 6 o'clock, or you like to come in at 7 and you like to leave at 4. As long as you're there during that core time. That's very beneficial for folks who have families, who have other things that they're going on outside. That could be very motivational, or at least keeping people involved as far as the job is concerned. Another thing to think about is job sharing. In other words, you might have two people who are sharing one job. So, for example, many years ago when I was working for a bank in Atlanta, I was responsible for the input area for all of the trust operations, all the trust accounts, and they were making purchases and sales and things like that as far as securities and stuff, and putting that into these trust accounts. Well, one of the things I started doing to make the jobs more palatable for folks, instead of having one person who's sitting there inputting all day long, what I did was I went to, in some cases, two part-timers, one coming in the morning, one coming in the afternoon. What they were doing is they were sharing that job, and they weren't being burned out nearly as much. Another alternative is the compressed work week. In other words, 4 days, maybe 4 10-hour days or something along those lines can help people stay a little more motivated or at least involved. Gives them more flexibility as far as what they want to do as far as their job is concerned. Another idea is what's called telework. Maybe one of the things that you do is you're working from home 2 days a week. All right. What that does is it makes it where offices need less space, and it gives you more flexibility as far as what it is that you're doing during the day, and you can make more decisions as far as what's actually happening. Now, the problem is you can't do that for people who are on a manufacturing line. You just can't work from home if you're on a manufacturing line. It works very, very well with people who are more information type of workers. Another thing to think about is what's called ergonomics. In other words, it's the study of how we are actually sitting and standing and doing our job so that we don't get burned out, so that we don't have physical issues. So, for example, a lot of times companies will have an ergonomics study of someone who is sitting down and inputting and using a computer all day. How are they sitting? How far away is the computer screen from them? Things like that. Now, one of the things that the federal government has is an agency called OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And what they're so responsible for is making sure that people are staying safe. In other words, they have guidelines as far as what it is that can be done. So, for example, for nursing, they have guidelines as far as how do you lift patients and things like this. If there are violations, then what they do is they enforce some of the changes that might be necessary, or there may be penalties that the company has to pay because of some of the violations. One of the things we also want to think about is when we're designing is jobs that meet mental capabilities and limitations. So, for example, you want to make sure that you're matching what kind of knowledge and what kind of concentration might be necessary as far as the mental aspect and that goes along with each of the jobs. So, for example, people who are routing airliners and for the FAA, okay, they're working in the towers and they're trying to track all of the planes, where they're at, things like that. Man, that can really be taxing as far as the mental aspect, keeping track of where all those different planes are, making sure that none of them crash into each other. We would need to make sure that we are limiting the amount of information and memorization that's necessary. When you start thinking about some of these air traffic controllers for the FAA and things like that, what they do is they split it out where you have this particular part of the sky and this other person has this particular part of the sky instead of a larger piece. They also make it, when it talks about adequate lighting with the FAA and air traffic controllers, it's kind of dark. as far as where it is that they're working in their offices and things, because they're sitting there looking at screens all day long. So in summary, one of the things we want to do is think about workflow analysis. How are we analyzing what it is that people are doing? The impact of that analysis. In other words, it feeds into the descriptions and the specifications and the performance reviews that people have. Work's changing. And one of the things to think about is how are we in organizations and in HR helping to address those changes and make it so that those changes are beneficial for the people and for the organization. We want to think about the job characteristics model, where we can make things more motivating for folks so that they can stay engaged and be a part of the organization. We also want to be thinking about ergonomics. What are we doing to reduce the physical aspects and the probabilities and possibilities of joint problems and things like that because of the job that people are doing. So that's it for Chapter 4. If you have questions, please give me a call.